My name is Lena Marsh and I was 36 years old, sitting in an attorney's office with my two brothers on either side of me, when we found out our father had rewritten his will 14 times in 22 years, not twice, not 5 times. 14. The last version had been executed at 11:47 in the morning. My father died at 3:12 that same afternoon. He had been on hospice care for 6 days. He had not eaten in 4. He had been on a morphine drip since Tuesday. The will left everything to a charitable foundation none of us had ever heard of, not to his children, not to his grandchildren, not to the people who had driven 2 hours every weekend for 6 days to sit in a room that smelled like antiseptic and old flowers and say goodbye to a man who had spent 22 years using his estate as a weapon. TOA Foundation. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to where this story really begins. Not to the attorney's office, not to the hospice room, further back, to a man named Gerald Marsh and the specific way he loved his children, which was completely and conditionally and never at the same time. My father Gerald Marsh was a man who built things, not with his hands, with money. He had started a regional logistics company at 31 with a $40,000 loan from his own father and had grown it over 3 decades into something worth considerably more. He was precise. He was demanding. He was the kind of man who believed that excellence was the baseline and that anything below it was a choice you made about your own character. He was also the kind of man who believed that love and inheritance were the same currency. I understood this earlier than my brothers did, I think, because I was the middle child and middle children develop a particular sensitivity to the emotional weather of a household. My older brother Paul was the firstborn and carried that with him in the specific way firstborns do, with a combination of pride and pressure that our father had installed in him so early it had become structural. My younger brother Derek was the baby and had learned that softness and charm were more effective than effort when it came to managing our father's moods. I was the one who watched the first time our father rewrote his will. I was 14. I know this because he told us at dinner, not quietly, not privately, not as a matter of family business handled with discretion. He announced it the way he announced everything he considered significant, at the head of the table with his fork set down and his full attention directed at whoever had disappointed him most recently. Paul had been caught cheating on a chemistry exam. He was 17. He had made a bad decision under pressure and had been caught and had confessed immediately when the teacher called our parents, which I had always thought spoke well of him regardless of the original mistake. My father did not see it that way. He said that a man who cheated was a man who couldn't be trusted. He said that a man who couldn't be trusted had no business inheriting anything built on trust. He said he had called his attorney that afternoon. Paul went white. My mother looked at her plate. Derek was 9 and didn't fully understand what was happening but understood enough to be very still. I understood completely. I was 14 and I understood that our father had just told his 17-year-old son that a chemistry exam had cost him his inheritance. The will was rewritten. Paul was removed. 3 months later, after Paul had maintained a 4.0 for one grading period and written a letter of apology to the teacher and the school board, our father called his attorney again. Paul was reinstated. Our father announced this at dinner as well, with the same gravity he had used for the removal, as though both events were equally significant demonstrations of his authority. This was the pattern. This was the architecture of our childhood. The will became a living document, not in the legal sense, in the sense that it breathed and shifted with our father's emotional temperature. It contracted when we disappointed him and expanded when we pleased him and was never, in 22 years, a static thing that simply sat in a filing cabinet and waited. It was a tool, the most effective one he had. Here is what you need to understand about Gerald Marsh before the rest of this makes sense. He was not a cruel man in the way cruelty is usually understood. He did not hit. He did not scream. He was not the father who raged at the dinner table and threw things and left rooms in pieces. He was something more precise than that. He was a man who had identified the exact leverage point in each of his children's lives and applied pressure there with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years running a logistics company and understood that the most effective systems were the ones that operated without friction. For Paul, the leverage was legacy. Paul had wanted since childhood to take over the company. Our father knew this. The will was the mechanism by which that possibility was extended or withdrawn. For Derek, the leverage was money itself. Derek had never been good with it. He had the charm and the warmth and the genuine likability of a person who assumes things will work out and is usually right just often enough to keep assuming. Our father knew that Derek's lifestyle required subsidy and that the promise of inheritance was the most reliable way to keep Derek compliant. For me, the leverage was different. I was a teacher. I had chosen a profession my father considered admirable in the abstract and impractical in the specific and had never fully forgiven me for not joining the company. He could not threaten me with the removal of something I had never wanted, so he found other ways. He made comments about my judgment. He questioned my husband quietly and consistently enough enough that my husband had stopped coming to family dinners by year 3 of our marriage. He told me once, very calmly, that he worried my choices would leave me dependent on people who might not always be there. He was talking about my husband. He was also talking about himself. I want to be honest with you about what those 22 years felt like because I think it matters. They felt like living inside a conditional sentence. Like every decision I made was preceded by an unwritten if. If you do this, then this. If you disappoint me, then this. If you please me, then this. The inheritance was never the point. The point was the uncertainty. The point was that we never knew, on any given day, exactly where we stood. And people who never know where they stand stay very close to the person who controls that information. That was the design. My mother, Patricia, had lived inside that design for 41 years. She was a gentle woman who had loved my father with the specific tired devotion of someone who had chosen a person very early and had spent decades making peace with who that person turned out to be. She did not challenge him. She did not defend us, at least not openly. She smoothed things afterward, in the quiet way, with cups of tea and careful conversations and the specific maternal skill of helping people feel less diminished than they actually were. She died 7 years before my father. Breast cancer, swift and brutal, from diagnosis to funeral in 5 months. My father cried at her funeral in a way I had never seen him cry before or after. He held her hand in the casket for a long time before they closed it. And then he drove home and called his attorney. He rewrote the will that same week. I don't know what changed in it that time. He didn't tell us. That was the only rewrite he didn't announce. I have always thought that one was private in a way the others weren't. That whatever he changed after my mother died was between him and whatever he believed about what came next. And the 7 years between my mother's death and his own. The rewrites accelerated. Year 1 after her death, 2 rewrites. Year 2, 1. Year 3, 3, including one that lasted 11 days before being reversed. Year 4, 2. Year 5, one that stood for 14 months, the longest any version had lasted in a decade. Year 6, 2. Year 7, his final year, the year he was diagnosed with the cardiac condition that would eventually take him. 3 rewrites before the hospice admission. And then the 14th, executed at 11:47 on the morning of the day he died. I did not know about the 14th rewrite until the attorney's office. Here is what I did know. 6 days before my father died, when the hospice team came and the decision was made and the room was arranged and the conversation shifted from treatment to comfort, my father asked to see his attorney. His name was Robert Vane. He had been my father's attorney for 19 years and had processed, by my count, all 14 versions of the will. I have thought about Robert Vane many times since. About what it must have felt like to process the same document 14 times for the same man. About whether he ever said anything. About whether professional obligation and personal conscience ever came into conflict in the 19 years he sat across from my father and made the changes Gerald Marsh requested. I don't know the answers to those questions. Robert Vane is not a person I ever spoke to directly. He retired 4 months after my father died and the estate passed to a different attorney at his firm. What I know is that Robert Vane came to the hospice facility on the morning of my father's last day. He arrived at 10:30. He was there for approximately 75 minutes. My father signed something at 11:47. Robert Vane left at approximately 11:55. My father died at 3:12 in the afternoon. I was in the building when Robert Vane arrived. I had been there since 6 in the morning. Paul had arrived at 7. Derek had come at 9, later than us, which had always been his way, and which our father had always noted and which on that particular morning none of us had the energy to discuss. I saw Robert Vane in the hallway. I recognized him from the one time I had met him, at a family meeting about estate planning 3 years earlier that my father had called and then controlled so completely that it had conveyed almost no actual information. I nodded to him. He nodded back. He went into my father's room. The door closed. I did not know what was happening behind that door. I went back to the waiting area and I sat with Paul and we talked about nothing in the specific way of people who are waiting for something they cannot stop and cannot speed up. Derek had gone to find coffee. The hallway was quiet. The door to my father's room stayed closed for 75 minutes. When Robert Vane came out he walked past us with his briefcase and a nod that I now understand was a man who knew exactly what he had just done and had decided that professionalism required him to say nothing about it. My father died 4 hours later. We were all in the room. The 3 of us and a hospice nurse named Carol who had a gentleness that I still think about. My father's breathing changed in the way they had told us it would and then it stopped and the room was very quiet and Carol said something soft that I didn't fully hear and then it was just the 3 of us and the body of the man who had rewritten his will 14 times and the particular silence of a room where something irreversible has just happened. Paul held it together. Derek did not. I sat in the chair beside the bed and held my father's hand which was already cooling and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not grief exactly. Not relief. Something more complicated than either. The specific emotional weight of losing someone you loved imperfectly and were never quite sure loved you back in a way that didn't come with conditions attached. The will reading was scheduled for 10 days later. I want to ask you something. Have you ever walked into a room already knowing that whatever happens next is going to require everything you have? That was me, walking into Robert Vane's firm on a Tuesday morning in November, with Paul on my left and Derek on my right, and the specific exhaustion of people who have been grieving and bracing simultaneously for 10 days. The attorney who handled the reading was not Robert Vane. He had transferred the file before his retirement. The new attorney's name was Susan Cho, and she was precise and careful and delivered the information the way good attorneys deliver difficult things. Clearly and without embellishment, she told us about the 14 versions. She laid them on the table. 14 documents spanning 22 years. The dates, the changes, the reinstatements. A paper record of every time our father had picked up the phone and called Robert Vane because one of his children had disappointed him or pleased him, or simply because the balance of power in the room needed to be recalibrated. She told us about the 14th version. She told us what it contained. A charitable foundation called the Gerald H. Marsh Legacy Fund, registered 4 months earlier, listed as sole beneficiary of the entire estate. Value of the estate at time of death, approximately $4.2 million. Amount designated to his 3 children, 0. I looked at the 14 documents on the table. I looked at Paul. I looked at Derek, who had gone the specific pale of someone whose financial assumptions have just been removed from beneath them without warning. And then I thought about the morphine drip, and the 4 days without food, and the 75 minutes behind a closed door, and a man who had used his will as a weapon for 22 years, executing one final version 4 hours before he died. And I asked Susan Cho one question. Is there any legal basis to challenge a will executed under those circumstances? She took off her glasses. She set them on the table. She looked at me the way attorneys look at people when the answer is yes, but the path is long, and what she said next was the beginning of everything. Susan Cho said one phrase that changed the shape of the room. Testamentary capacity. She said it carefully, the way attorneys say things they know will matter, with the specific weight of someone who has chosen the word precisely and wants it to land exactly where she aimed it. She explained what it meant. For a will to be legally valid, the person signing it must possess testamentary capacity at the moment of signing. They must understand the nature of the document they are executing. They must understand the extent of their estate. They must understand who their natural heirs are and their relationship to them. And they must be free from any condition, medical or otherwise, that would prevent them from forming a rational, independent decision. My father had signed the 14th version at 11:47 in the morning on the 6th day of hospice care. He had not eaten in 4 days. He had been on a continuous morphine drip since Tuesday. His last coherent conversation, according to the hospice notes, had occurred 2 days before the signing. Susan Cho said she could not tell us whether the will would hold. She could tell us that the circumstances of its execution raised questions that a court would take seriously. She gave us the name of an estate litigation attorney. His name was Franklin Osei, and he had, Susan told us, successfully challenged 3 wills in the last 4 years on testamentary capacity grounds. I called Franklin Osei from the parking lot of Susan Cho's office while Paul stood beside me and Derek sat in the car with his head in his hands. Franklin answered on the second ring. I told him everything. The 14 versions, the morphine drip, the 4 days without food, the 75 minutes behind a closed door, the signature at 11:47, the death at 3:12. Franklin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need you to get me the hospice records. All of them. Every nurse's note, every medication log, every observation from the 6 days of admission. I need them before the end of the week. He also said something else. He said, I need you to think carefully about whether anyone else was present during the attorney's visit. Anyone who might have observed your father's condition or the circumstances of the signing. I thought about Carol, the hospice nurse with the gentleness I still thought about. The one who had been in the room when my father died. The one who had been on shift all week. I called the hospice facility the next morning. Carol had been the primary nurse on my father's case for the full 6 days of admission. She had documented everything with the specific thoroughness of someone who understood that hospice notes were legal records and treated them accordingly. She had been present in the hallway when Robert Vane arrived. She had checked on my father at 11:15, 32 minutes before the signing, and had documented his condition in her notes. The notes from 11:15 described a patient who was minimally responsive to verbal stimulation, who had not opened his eyes during the assessment, and who had required repositioning without apparent awareness. At 11:47, according to Robert Vane's own documentation filed with the will, my father had signed his name to a document changing his entire estate. Franklin read the 11:15 note and said 4 words. This is our case. I want to be honest with you about the months that followed. They were not simple. They were not fast. Challenging a will is not a clean or quick process, and it is expensive in ways I had not fully calculated, and it happened at the same time as grief, which does not wait for legal proceedings to conclude before it demands to be felt. Paul was steady throughout. He was the firstborn and he had spent a lifetime being steady, and this was the moment all of that practice was actually required. He handled the paperwork. He coordinated with Franklin. He made the calls I couldn't make on the days I couldn't make them. Derek was less steady. He needed the money in a way that Paul and I did not, and that need made everything harder for him. He called me at irregular hours with questions I couldn't answer and fears I understood but couldn't absorb. I let him talk. It was the most useful thing I could offer. I taught my classes. I came home. I sat at my kitchen table and read Franklin's updates and tried to hold the two things simultaneously: the grief for my father and the legal fight against the document he had signed 4 hours before he died, and discovered that holding two enormous things at once is possible, but it changes the shape of your hands. The hospice records were the foundation of our case. Carol's notes from 11:15 were specific and clinical and entirely inconsistent with a man capable of executing a legal document 32 minutes later. Franklin subpoenaed the complete medication logs. The morphine dosage on the morning of the signing was the highest it had been during the entire admission. The nursing assessments from the preceding 48 hours documented a consistent and progressive decline in responsiveness and cognitive function. Franklin retained a medical expert, a geriatric physician named Dr. Anita Sood, who had testified in 17 estate cases and who reviewed the complete hospice record and provided a written opinion that stated clearly that based on the documented clinical picture, it was her professional opinion that the patient lacked the cognitive capacity to execute a legal document at the time of the signing. That opinion was the second pillar of our case. The third was the Gerald H. Marsh Legacy Fund itself. Franklin's paralegal researched the foundation's registration. It had been incorporated 4 months before my father's death. Its registered agent was a man named Victor Hale. Franklin ran Victor Hale's name through every relevant database and found 3 things. Victor Hale had no prior connection to charitable work of any kind. Victor Hale had been employed by my father's logistics company as a consultant for 18 months, a period that overlapped exactly with the foundation's incorporation. And Victor Hale had, 2 weeks after my father's death, filed paperwork to become the foundation's executive director with a salary attached to the role that Franklin described to me as inconsistent with any charitable mission I have ever seen documented. I want you to understand what this meant. My father had not, in his final months, developed a sudden passion for charitable giving. Someone, or some combination of people, had created a vehicle to receive $4.2 million from a dying man and had then positioned themselves to control and benefit from that vehicle. Whether my father had understood what he was doing when he signed is one question. Whether he had been guided to this decision by someone with a financial interest in the outcome is a different question. Franklin pursued both. The deposition of Robert Vane took place 8 months after we filed the challenge. He had retired but was required to appear. He arrived with his own attorney, which Franklin told me was itself informative. I was not in the room for the deposition. Franklin was. He called me afterward. He said Robert Vane had maintained throughout that my father had been lucid and coherent and had expressed his wishes clearly at the time of signing. He said Vane had become less certain when presented with Carol's 11:15 note. He said Vane had become significantly less certain when presented with the medication log showing the morphine dosage administered at 10:45 that morning, 47 minutes before the signing. He said there was a moment in the deposition when Robert Vane looked at the medication log and then looked at his own attorney and said nothing for a long time. Franklin said that silence was the most useful thing Vane had produced in 4 hours of testimony. Victor Hale's deposition was taken separately. He claimed my father had approached him with the idea for the foundation. He claimed it had been entirely my father's initiative. He claimed he had simply agreed to help establish it as a favor to a man he respected. Franklin asked him to produce any documentation of my father initiating the foundation idea. Any email, any text message, any memo, any record of any kind showing that Gerald Marsh had first raised the concept. Victor Hale could not produce any such documentation. Franklin asked him to explain why the foundation's executive director salary had been set at a figure that represented 31% of the foundation's projected annual income from the estate. Victor Hale said he had not set the figure himself. Franklin asked who had. Victor Hale said he didn't recall. The case was mediated 11 months after Franklin filed the challenge. I will not walk you through every session. Mediation in estate cases is a particular kind of exhausting, the kind that requires you to sit in a room and negotiate over the remnants of a person you are simultaneously grieving and being realistic about, and it asks things of you that ordinary grieving does not. What I will tell you is what was determined. The 14th will was set aside on the grounds of lack of testamentary capacity. The medical evidence was sufficient. Dr. Sood's opinion was uncontested by any expert the foundation's attorneys produced. The 11:15 nursing note was 11 pages of specific clinical documentation that said, in the careful language of medical record keeping, that the man who signed that document at 11:47 was not the same man who had rewritten his will 14 times over 22 years. The 13th version was the operative document. I need to tell you about the 13th version. It had been executed 14 months before my father's death, during the longest period of stability in the document's 22-year history. It divided the estate equally among his 3 children. It included a specific bequest to each grandchild for education. It included a letter, attached but not legally binding, that my father had written himself and asked Robert Vane to include. Susan Cho gave us the letter at a separate meeting, after the mediation had concluded and the 13th version had been confirmed as operative. It was 2 pages, my father's handwriting, which I would know anywhere, in the specific deliberate script of a man who had learned penmanship in a different era and had never stopped using it. He wrote about the company. He wrote about what it had cost him to build it. He wrote about my mother in a way he had never spoken about her while she was alive, with a directness and a tenderness that made Paul have to leave the room. He wrote about us, each of us separately. He wrote about Paul with the particular pride of a man who had been too hard on his firstborn and knew it and had never quite found the way to say so while there was still time. He wrote about Derek with a warmth that acknowledged everything Derek was and everything Derek struggled with and asked us to look after him in the way that families look after the ones who need it most. He wrote about me. He said I had been the one who watched. He said he had always known that. He said he had not always known what to do with a child who saw everything, who could not be managed the way the others could, who had looked at him across dinner tables for 30 years with eyes that understood more than he wanted them to. He said he was sorry for the conditional nature of his love. He used that exact phrase, the conditional nature of his love. He said he had learned it from his own father and had tried to do better and had not done better and had known that and had not known how to change it. He said the will was his attempt to say, at the end, what he had not known how to say in the middle. I read that letter 3 times in Susan Cho's office. Then I folded it. I put it in my bag. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, not crying, just sitting. The way you sit when something has shifted and you need to let the new arrangement settle before you can move around in it. My father had rewritten his will 14 times. He had used it as a weapon for 22 years. He had made us uncertain and conditional and careful in ways that cost us things I am still calculating. He had also written 2 pages in his careful deliberate handwriting and asked his attorney to keep them with the document he most wanted to stand. Not the 14th version, executed at 11:47 on a morphine drip with a man who wanted 31% of his estate waiting for the check. The 13th, the one he had written when he was still himself. The one with the letter. He had known, I think, at the end, that something was wrong. That the man with the briefcase and the foundation paperwork was not there for him. That whatever was happening in that room was not the ending he would have chosen if he had been able to choose clearly. He had not been able to stop it. He was too far gone by then to stop anything. But 14 months earlier, on a day when he was still himself, he had written 2 pages in his careful handwriting and asked Robert Vane to keep them attached to the version he most wanted to stand. He had fixed it in advance, in the only way he still could. The company was sold 2 years after the estate settled. Paul negotiated the sale. He had always been the one who understood it best, who had wanted it most, who had spent a lifetime being prepared for it and then uncertain of it and then prepared again depending on which version of the will was current. He handled it with the steadiness he had always had. He called me after the closing and his voice was the voice of a man who has finished something very long. Derek is doing better. He has a financial advisor now, which he resisted for 2 years and then accepted and which has made a measurable difference. He calls me on Sundays sometimes. Not every Sunday, but sometimes. I still teach. I was never going to do anything else. My father spent 22 years being quietly disappointed by that and I spent 22 years being quietly certain of it and we were both right in our own ways and the distance between those 2 rights was the distance between us for most of my adult life. I have the letter. It lives in the drawer of my bedside table. I don't read it often. When I do it is usually late at night when the house is quiet and I need to hold something that is true about him. The conditional nature of his love. His words. His handwriting. His attempt to say at the end what he had not known how to say in the middle. It is not everything I wanted, but it is more than I expected. And after 22 years of conditional, more than expected feels like something worth keeping. If you have ever loved someone imperfectly and been imperfectly loved in return, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth people leave behind is sometimes more honest than anything they managed to say while they were still here. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.